On the 22nd of July 1943, the US 7th Army captured Palermo, the largest city on Sicily, after General George Patton's forces had taken 100 miles of Axis territory in 72 hours. Patton was relentless and continued charging about Sicily, conquering towns and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners of war. In response, 3 days after the fall of Palermo, the Grand Council of Fascism removed Benito Mussolini from power. After Sicily, Patton was the most feared Allied commander in Europe. So, why was this tactically brilliant general sidelined when the D-Day campaign took place a year later? This is the story of George Patton, a brilliant general and utterly flawed man. The man known to history as George Smith Patton Jr. was born on the 11th of November 1885 in San Gabriel in the state of California. Although he was generally known as George Jr., he was theoretically George Patton III, as his father and grandfather both had the same name as him. His father, George, was an attorney, businessman, and politician who served for 3 months as the district attorney of Los Angeles County in 1887 and, much later, as the mayor of San Marino. The family had a military background, and young George's grandfather had died fighting for the Confederacy during the American Civil War. George Jr.'s mother was Ruth Wilson, the daughter of one of California's wealthiest men, Benjamin Davis Wilson, a businessman who had moved out to California when it was still under Mexican rule and who subsequently became the second mayor of Los Angeles in the middle of the gold rush after the region was annexed by the US in 1848. After Ruth married George Patton Sr., they lived in San Gabriel on the Lake Vineyard estate owned by her father. They had 2 children, George Jr. and his younger sister Anne, who was known as Nita. The Patton family were descended from the Lords of Glamorgan, a Welsh family, as well as from King Edward I of England, while they had Scottish and French Huguenot ancestry and were tied to a branch of the family of George Washington. George Jr. was tutored at home until he was 11 years old. His literacy skills were consequently underdeveloped when he began attending Stephen Clark's School for Boys, a private school in Pasadena. Once he did learn to read, he did so avidly and became especially interested in books on military history and commanders such as Julius Caesar, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, and Napoleon Bonaparte. He also read the works of John Singleton Mosby, a Confederate cavalry commander known as the Grey Ghost, on account of his ability to attack the enemy and then seemingly vanish. The Pattons' own extended legacy as a military family, with many relatives who fought in the American Revolutionary War and the Civil War, left an impression on George from a young age and became an important part of his identity. It was unsurprising, then, that at 17 years of age, George set off across the country to enroll in the Virginia Military Institute in 1903, an institution which both his father and grandfather had attended before him. He was later nominated to the Military Academy at West Point. This was already established as the elite training school for future military officers in the US. Alumni included Ulysses S. Grant, George Custer, Stonewall Jackson, and John Pershing, the latter of whom would soon play a role in Patton's career. In some ways, Patton was well suited to life at West Point, but he struggled at mathematics, a subject that was considered increasingly important at the academy in a time when military logistics were becoming central to military command. He excelled at sports, as he was already an accomplished horseman and competed in track and field events too. He joined the football team, but after injuring his arm, he moved over to the fencing team instead. After his initial difficulties, George did well at West Point and was made a cadet sergeant major in his junior year and an adjutant in his senior year. After graduating, he left in June 1909 after being commissioned as a second lieutenant assigned to the 15th Cavalry Division at Fort Sheridan in Illinois. Later, he was transferred to Fort Myer in Virginia. On the 26th of May 1910, Patton married Beatrice Banning Eyre, the daughter of a Boston industrialist, Frederick Eyre, at Beverly Farms in Massachusetts. They went on to have 3 children together, Beatrice, Ruth, and George Patton IV. While still serving at Fort Myer as quartermaster of his troop in 1911, George befriended Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, whose aide he became. George also continued as a fencer, and his skill led him to being sent to participate at the Summer Olympics in Stockholm in 1912, where he finished in 5th place overall in the modern pentathlon, which consisted of swimming, pistol shooting, running, fencing, and riding. Patton was the highest placed of the non-Swedish participants. He was among the top 5 performers in fencing, swimming, and horse riding, but was placed in 20th position in the shooting event. Controversy arose over the scoring for George's shooting, as he had used a .38 caliber pistol, whilst other competitors were using .22 caliber pistols. George argued that some of his shots must have passed straight through the previous holes he had made in the scorecard because of the larger impact holes that the higher caliber pistol had made. The adjudicators disagreed and concluded that some of his shots had missed the target completely. If his argument was correct, he would likely have medalled at the Olympics. He returned home via France, where he studied fencing under Sir Charles Cléry, a master-at-arms of the French Cavalry Academy. On his return to the US, Patton designed a new sword, the model 1913 cavalry sabre, known as the Patton sabre. In 1913, an order was placed by the military for 20,000 of these blades. Later, he was made Master of the Sword, the most prestigious title offered to swordsmanship instructors at Fort Riley in Kansas, where he was then stationed. Patton attended the Mounted Service School after returning to the US and graduated in the summer of 1915. He was assigned to the 15th Cavalry, which was bound for the Philippines, an American colony at the time, but before he was sent to Southeast Asia, he persuaded influential contacts in Washington to intervene to have him reassigned to the 8th Cavalry instead at Fort Bliss in Texas, as he feared a post in the Philippines would prove to be a career dead end. Instead, with the Mexican Revolution underway throughout the 1910s and the war threatening to spill over the border into places like Texas, Patton viewed assignment to Fort Bliss as preferential over the Philippines. In this way, Patton's first experience of active military combat came in 1916 when he took part in the Pancho Villa expedition, the U.S. Army's campaign against the paramilitary forces of Mexican revolutionary Francisco Pancho Villa, whose men had attacked the border town of Columbus in New Mexico on the 9th of March 1916, along with nearby Camp Furlong. In response, General Frederick Funston, leader of the 8th Cavalry, who was stationed at Fort Bliss, was ordered to secure the Mexico-United States border and to pursue Villa and his men. Patton's unit was not part of the force, and so George appealed to Commander John Pershing to serve as his personal aide in the campaign, acting as a courier and helping to plan the action along the border area. George's eagerness and dedication to the task at hand impressed Pershing, and in April 1916 he appointed Patton to command Troop C of the 13th Cavalry, the unit that was tasked with hunting down Villa and his subordinates. Thus, on the 14th of May 1916, Patton first saw combat, a date also famous today for the first use of motorized transport in American military history, as cavalry units began to diversify away from horses. However, the overall expedition, which ended in February 1917, was ultimately unsuccessful as they failed in their main goal, which was to capture Pancho Villa, instead killing several of his followers, including Colonel Candelario Cervantes, General Francisco Beltran, and Villa's second-in-command, Julio Cardenas. At one point during his mission, Patton and his subordinates, in a trio of Dodge touring cars, encountered a number of Villa's men who were foraging for food. According to accounts, Patton shot 3 of the bandits. Patton's brash approach to military command, where he had no reservations about putting himself in harm's way, gained him both admiration and notoriety. The American press labelled him as the bandit killer shortly afterwards. Patton was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant after this excursion after Villa. For several months, Pershing, Patton, and their men remained on the Mexico border conducting training. However, even though the Civil War dragged on in Mexico, the focus of U.S. military activity was soon drawn elsewhere to Europe after the U.S. entry into the First World War in April 1917. Pershing, with Patton in tow, was appointed to command the advance American expeditionary force that was sent to Western Europe, while wider war mobilization was underway at home. Patton personally requested to join Pershing in France, and his request was granted, resulting in him being promoted to captain, after which he joined Pershing in the advance party of officers that headed to Europe. There, he worked as Pershing's personal aide, overseeing the last-minute training of American troops who were steadily arriving in their tens of thousands. After overseeing this work in Paris, in September 1917, Patton was reassigned to Chaumont as post adjutant, being placed in charge of the company that ran the American base. Patton was not temperamentally suited to this position, and he complained to Pershing, asking him to reassign him to front-line duties. It was during this period that Patton first encountered the piece of military hardware that would revolutionize both his own strategic thinking and the entire nature of modern warfare. The first tanks were developed and deployed in 1916 by the British as a pioneering means of reducing the lethality of machine guns on the Western Front. By placing men inside what was basically a giant moving metal box, it was envisaged that the stalemate created by trench warfare could be broken. Soon the Germans, and in particular the French, were developing what would come to be described as armoured cavalry. After a bout of sick leave as he recovered from jaundice, Patton made the acquaintance of Colonel Fox Connor, an operations officer with the American Expeditionary Force in Paris, who encouraged Patton to seek a position commanding one of the new tank regiments. Consequently, on the 10th of November 1917, Patton was assigned to the American Expeditionary Force Light Tank School. While he was fascinated with the possibilities that the new machines offered, he had to acquaint himself with the nuances of the hardware. He was therefore attached to the French tank school, where he first drove a Renault FT light tank. After doing so, he became convinced that these new weapons were the future of terrestrial combat. Once he heard that the British were planning a mass attack of tanks on the German line at Cambrai, which proved to be the largest use of these vehicles thus far, Patton arranged to meet Colonel J.F.C. Fuller, the Chief of Staff of the British Tank Corps, in order to learn more about how to incorporate the metallic weapons of war into the US armed forces. On his way back to Paris after meeting with Fuller not far from Cambrai, Patton stopped at the Renault factory to watch tanks being assembled there. He was promoted to the rank of Major in January of 1918. Less than a month later, the Americans were given 10 tanks by the French to use at their training school at Bulge. As the only relatively senior American officer to have driven one of these, Patton was assigned to instruct others in how to use these armoured vehicles. At the same time, he was trying to convince his superiors within the American military that the use of the tanks on the battlefield was the future. This was easier said than done, as at this early stage in their development these were still extremely slow and often mechanically unreliable. Many within the American Expeditionary Force believed they had limited utility. Undaunted, Patton tenaciously continued to press his case, and it wasn't long before tanks were beginning to be incorporated into the American Army's battle plans for the closing stages of the conflict. In tandem, Patton was promoted once again in April 1918 to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He took part on the 12th of September 1918 during the Saint-Mihiel offensive and again on the 26th of the month in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where he was injured while storming the German lines after his tanks had become isolated and cut off from the main attack. Though the bullet wound in his left leg was serious, Patton commanded the attack from the safety of a shell hole for over an hour before being rescued, insisting on personally submitting his report of the battle to the command post before going to the field hospital where he was treated for the injury. The wound kept Patton out of the fighting until the war ended on the 11th of November 1918. Despite not having experienced much direct combat in the Great War, Patton had helped to demonstrate to the American forces the potential power of tank warfare and that he was a commander with innovative ideas. The interwar years were not a particularly happy time for Patton, as he became agitated by the extended peace and the lack of opportunities for an active command. In the interim, he continued to push for the expanded incorporation of tank divisions into the military. In 1919, he was sent to Washington, D.C. to join a committee dedicated to writing a manual on tank operations for future conflicts. At this juncture, he began arguing that tanks should have their own armoured unit rather than fulfilling the role of simply supporting infantry divisions. Yet, while his push for the development of independent armoured divisions was supported by his friend Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Secretary of War, Dwight Davis, there was no appetite in Washington for funding such a costly initiative now that the war was over. As a result, the first armoured corps within the US Army would not be developed until 1940. Patton moved between various posts in the years that followed. In 1924, he attended the General Staff College, where he graduated 25th out of a school of 248. In the summer of 1932, in the midst of the economic crisis of the Great Depression, over 17,000 World War I veterans converged on the capital to protest over the failure of the government to convert their wartime bonuses into cash. On the 28th of July 1932, this protest turned violent when the police attempted to break up the demonstration. Patton was ordered to march with 600 men against the protesters. However, he was reluctant to do so, having considerable sympathy for the veterans' cause. Nevertheless, he obeyed orders and the so-called bonus army was driven away. At the start of 1935, Patton was transferred to Hawaii. While he was there, he observed the growing expansion of the Japanese Empire in the Far East and the large Japanese community on the Hawaiian Islands. He therefore developed a plan to detain the Japanese people living in Hawaii in the event of an invasion. This was controversial, though it ultimately became government policy after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. In 1937, as the Japanese invaded China, Patton also correctly predicted a potential surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet by the Japanese in future years in a paper he wrote entitled Surprise. As the peacetime lull continued and Patton became bored, he developed a drinking problem and even began an extramarital affair with his niece-in-law, Jean Gordon, when he was 49 and she was 21, although there is a debate among historians as to whether or not this affair really took place. Some biographies argue it was merely a rumor without any evidence to support it. The end of his long hiatus from active war came nearer on the 1st of September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began in Europe. Although the US was not initially involved in the conflict, it began to mobilize as a precaution, and Patton worked to ensure that this mobilization included the building up of independent armored divisions. In 1940, the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions were created. On the 4th of April 1941, Patton was promoted to the rank of Major General. Patton also staged a practice exercise in which 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles raced from the state of Georgia to Florida. To increase his tactical knowledge, Patton earned a pilot's license so that he could observe these exercises from the sky and thus gain a better insight into the movements of armored units across long distances. These huge exercises in the southeast of the country gained considerable attention, captivating the nation with Patton's new method of warfare. Patton also developed a training center in the deserts of California in 1941, aiming to simulate the conditions of the North African desert, which had developed into an Allied theatre of war. On the 7th of December 1941, just as Patton had predicted 4 years earlier, the Japanese launched a devastating surprise assault on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The US declared war on Japan the following day, and on Japan's ally, Germany, 3 days later, forming the Allied alliance with Britain, the Soviet Union, and other powers like Canada and the Free French. On the 15th of January 1942, Patton was placed in command of the 1st Armored Corps and immediately began stepping up training exercises in the Desert Training Center. Patton's speed and aggression defined his command style and his military career as a whole. In this sense, he was very similar to the Axis general Erwin Rommel, who had dominated the German command in the North African theatre. Perhaps it was not surprising, then, that Patton's first major command in the Second World War was in North Africa, where his friend, Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower, assigned Patton to help plan the US invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch. This was intended to support the British forces already stationed in Egypt and to push out the Germans and Italians while also subduing the Vichy French forces in Algeria and Morocco. Patton was given command of the Western Task Force, some 33,000 men who he ordered to begin landings centred on Casablanca in Morocco on the 8th of November 1942. Before these landings began, Patton addressed his troops in a way which epitomised his military philosophy, stating, "We shall attack, and attack until we are exhausted, and then we shall attack again." Despite meeting staunch resistance from the Vichy French forces, Patton's men gained a beachhead in Morocco and pressed on to Casablanca, which fell on the 11th of November. Patton then turned this into a military port, which acted as an entry point henceforth for further Allied supplies and reinforcements for the North Africa campaign. A conference of the Allied leaders, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was held here in January 1943. However, US forces suffered a setback weeks later when the Second Corps, under Major General Fredendall, was defeated at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia by Field Marshal Rommel's Africa Corps. The poorly led American troops were pushed back 50 miles by Rommel's experienced veterans, taking heavy casualties along the way. Patton responded by removing Fredendall from command, heightening military discipline across US forces, pushing his troops hard, and instilling fear and discipline into the men. In response, the men nicknamed Patton Old Blood and Guts, due to his lust for battle and harsh command style. Nonetheless, Patton was an inspiring figure for his troops, setting an example for them with his theatrical image, wearing a highly polished helmet with cavalry boots and brandishing a pair of ivory-handled pistols, a flashy bit of behaviour he had adopted all the way back in 1916 after he acquired one of these guns in New Mexico. He also travelled in a vehicle bearing his rank insignia in large letters, with sirens blaring from the truck to indicate he was unafraid of enemy snipers. Patton's measures helped US forces to swiftly regain the offensive, and on the 17th of March 1943, they captured the Tunisian city of Gafsa in the Battle of El Guettar. With the situation in Tunisia improving for the Allies, Eisenhower recalled Patton in April to take control of American forces for Operation Husky, the planned Allied invasion of Sicily to open a southern front in Europe. This was scheduled for July 1943. However, Patton was frustrated as the British commanders clearly viewed the Americans as inexperienced and tried to sideline his 7th Army in favour of British General Bernard Montgomery leading the expedition. Patton soon proved them wrong. After the Allies landed in Sicily on the 10th of July, Montgomery's forces met strong resistance, in response to which Patton charged onwards with his men and captured the Sicilian capital Palermo. Then, with Montgomery's advance slowed by strong Axis resistance, Patton led his forces deeper into Sicily and reached the northeastern port of Messina on the 17th of August. With this advance, Patton's armoured forces had thus achieved a lightning-quick success in Sicily, inflicting over 110,000 casualties on the Italians and Germans, mostly in captured prisoners of war. Patton had distinguished himself in this campaign as one of the finest Allied commanders, but his fierce temper threatened to undermine his military success. Unlike many other commanders, George Patton made frequent visits to combat hospitals, seeing it as a general's duty to view his wounded troops. On the 3rd of August, Patton came across an infantryman in a hospital with no visible injuries. After questioning him, Patton erupted and slapped the soldier, pushing him out of the hospital tent. A week later, he repeated this behavior with another soldier and accused him of cowardice. Eisenhower reprimanded Patton for these incidents and attempted to prevent the story being released to the American public. However, it was leaked in November 1943, causing a furious reaction from Congress and the public and greatly denting Patton's domestic reputation. Patton's behavior had raised enough questions about his temperament that his subordinate, Omer Bradley, was seen thereafter as being more reliable and was chosen to lead the US First Army in the upcoming invasion of Nazi-occupied France. This does not mean that Patton's services were not availed of. The Allied command knew that the Germans respected and feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. Thus, Patton was placed in charge of a fictitious US Army group, as part of the Allied plan was to deceive the Germans as to where and when they would invade France. This was the first US Army Group, or FUSAG, and the leaked intelligence on the positioning and communications of the fake army convinced Berlin that the Allied landing would occur at Pas-de-Calais, when in reality the chosen Allied landing spot was further west on the beaches of Normandy. Once the decoy attempt had been undertaken, Patton was redeployed and given command of a real force in France, the US Third Army. He arrived to France on the 6th of July 1944, a month after the initial D-Day landings. Patton's mission was to take his force west to capture the ports of Brittany. On the 1st of August 1944, with his armoured units leading the way, Patton stormed through the northwestern corner of France at breakneck speed, quickly overrunning the province. The speed with which he carried out this exercise indicated that Patton knew that Brittany was only a sideshow in the war. He wanted to get back into the thick of the action in trying to liberate Paris and then pushing on into Belgium and eastern France. Thus, with Brittany subdued, Patton reoriented his forces eastwards and on the 3rd of August began his lightning advance. When battling through the German defences at Normandy in June, advancing a mile a day was considered good progress for the Allies. However, Patton demanded that his fast-moving armoured divisions advance upwards of 50 miles a day. In this way, he was soon able to turn back eastwards from Brittany, and he and his Third Army played an important role in the trapping of tens of thousands of German soldiers in the Falaise pocket in mid-August. Patton was greatly assisted by air support during his French campaign, whose reconnaissance patrols informed Patton's forces of enemy positions and whose bombers provided protection and support for his armoured columns. Additionally, air support was incredibly valuable for Patton in securing his flanks, as during his lightning advances, Patton's lines often became long and thin, making the rear of his forces vulnerable to enemy counterattacks. With the Battle of Normandy virtually over after the capture of the Falaise pocket, Patton wished to advance on Paris, but he was directed to move southeast towards Lorraine in eastern France, thus allowing the Free French forces to liberate their own capital on the 25th of August 1944. Patton's eastwards offensive came to a halt at the end of August as supplies, in particular fuel, began to dwindle. He was extremely frustrated by this and criticized Montgomery and other Allied commanders, claiming he was being hampered by the slow movement of others. The autumn of 1944 was frustrating for Patton. His forces were battered by heavy rain and met stern resistance from the Germans, who had been preparing the border defences between France and Germany since D-Day. There was, for instance, staunch resistance met in the city of Metz, which didn't fall until the 22nd of November. Ever the military history buff, Patton commented to his staff upon the fall of Metz that it was the first time in over 400 years that the city, so often a battleground in Europe's violent history, had been taken by direct assault. There was a touch of hyperbole here. The city had been captured by the Germans in 1870 during the early stages of the Franco-Prussian War, though that was after a 2-month-long siege. By early December 1944, Patton's supply situation was improving, as the capture of the port of Antwerp by the Allies in September 1944 had allowed for increased supply from Britain to the continent. He consequently became central to the planning for launching a winter offensive aimed at Frankfurt and the River Rhine. However, in mid-December, the Nazis launched a desperate counterattack through the Ardennes forest with the goal of retaking Antwerp and slowing the Allies' advance into Germany. Remarkably, Patton and his staff officers were the only major Allied command unit to see that the Germans were preparing to counterattack in advance of the assault with 250,000 men on the 16th of December 1944. Due to his prior intelligence of the assault, Patton was already planning an attack on the southern flank of the bulge that the German advance created in the Allied lines through their offensive. He thus informed Eisenhower that he could engage the German flank, and Patton's troops duly turned north to smash into the flanks of the advancing Axis army. Patton's Third Army pushed on in the days that followed to the Belgian town of Bastogne, which they reached on the 26th of December. There, the US 101st Airborne Division had been surrounded by the Germans. Patton's move opened up a supply corridor for the besieged Allied forces at Bastogne. Patton's incredible maneuver, diverting 2/3 of his army from the front line and racing to the German flank within 2 days, helped the Allies quickly turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge, preventing the Germans from reaching the River Meuse. His rapid and decisive maneuvers in response to the assault contrasted with the slow response and lack of foresight of the other US generals. Patton was the only Allied commander who came out of the Ardennes offensive with his reputation enhanced. He was consequently given greater resources in the spring offensive into Germany. Patton's Palatinate offensive began on the 12th of March 1945. During it, his aggressiveness allowed him to exploit the weakened Wehrmacht, pushing his armoured divisions in between gaps in the German lines. The Third Army made spectacular gains along the Rhine throughout March, taking some 100,000 prisoners. Though Field Marshal Montgomery was organising an immense operation to cross the Rhine River with considerable artillery and air support, on the 23rd of March, with Patton's forces already attempting a crossing after building a pontoon bridge, Old Blood and Guts phoned General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, and announced that, quote, "You can tell the world Third Army made it before Monty." Patton clearly looked down on the cautious, methodical British commander whose operations he perceived as being allocated too many Allied resources. Despite his successes in Germany, Patton could be prone to errors of judgment. For example, he sent a force to liberate a prisoner camp near Heidelberg, 40 miles behind enemy lines on the 26th of March, having learned that his son-in-law was held captive there. This force was captured by the Germans, while the camp was subsequently freed a week later by other US forces, making the operation a complete waste of men. Annoyance at this setback turned to horror as Patton and his men advanced further into Germany and liberated the concentration camp at Ohrdruf in April 1945. Even Old Blood and Guts, as tough as he was shaken by what he witnessed there. After a rapid advance through southern Germany against an exhausted Wehrmacht, Patton reached the Czechoslovak border on the 4th of May. He wanted to immediately push on to Prague before the war ended and for the Allies to take part in the capture of Berlin in order to limit the Soviet sphere of influence in Central Europe. However, Eisenhower rejected this plan as it ran counter to the terms of the Yalta Conference, where the Allied leaders had agreed that most of Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe would become Soviet spheres of influence after the war. Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies on the 7th of May 1945, bringing the Second World War to an end in Europe, although VE Day is celebrated on the 8th of May. At that stage, Patton and the Third Army had been in active combat since the 1st of August 1944, a span of 281 days. Indeed, Patton's forces captured more land and prisoners than any other Allied army in the European theatre. The Allied invasion of Europe was thus the peak of Patton's military career, his finest campaign. However, it would also be his last. Following the German surrender, Patton returned home on the 7th of June 1945 for a brief period of leave, during which time he spoke at huge gatherings of admirers and took part in military parades. He also lobbied for a command in the Pacific theatre of war, where the US was still fighting Japan. Instead, after returning to Europe, he was appointed as military governor of the German state of Bavaria, a political role that the maverick Patton was not at all suited for. Once in that position, he attracted controversy with his outspoken anti-Soviet and anti-Semitic remarks. What most angered the US High Command was his tolerance of former Nazis in political posts across local government in Bavaria. Furthermore, Patton openly stated what most Allied commanders already knew but did not wish to say aloud, that post-war Germany could not be properly administered without the support of some former Nazis, as there had been millions of active members of the party. Many Allied commanders probably partially empathized with his inflammatory statements about continuing the war and invading the Soviet Union as well, but they were anathema to the Allied High Command. As the crisis over Patton's statements continued, he was relieved of his military governorship by Eisenhower in late September. Then, on the 7th of October 1945, he was relieved of the command of the Third Army as well, causing Patton to remark at the change of command that all good things must come to an end. The best thing that has ever happened to me thus far is the honor and privilege of having commanded the Third Army. Patton remained in Europe as commander of the 15th Army. This was, though, largely an office job, as the 15th Army was tasked with writing an official historical account of the war in Europe. In response to his demotion, Patton considered retiring from the armed forces altogether. However, he never returned home, as on the 9th of December 1945, shortly before noon, Patton's car collided with a US Army truck, causing him severe injuries, including a broken neck. Although Old Blood and Guts lingered in hospital for 12 days, he eventually died on the 21st of December 1945 at the age of 60. He was buried, as he had requested, alongside other soldiers of the Third Army near Luxembourg City in the Ardennes, the site of one of his finest hours as a soldier. George S. Patton was a giant of American military history and is one of the most famous Allied commanders of the Second World War, though he was also one of the most controversial. Despite his reputation as a tough, brute force soldier, Patton was actually a military intellectual and was well read on military history from his youth onwards. For instance, he regularly contributed to military journals on a range of topics. He also saw where warfare was headed from early on in his career. After serving in France during the First World War, he concluded that armoured divisions of tanks and other vehicles would be central to the armies of the 20th century. His deployment of swift-moving armoured divisions like this made him an American version of Heinz Guderian, the German commander who was responsible above all others for the blitzkrieg warfare deployed to such effect in France and the Low Countries in the summer of 1940 and against the Soviet Union in the first months of the war with the Russians between June and October 1941. Beyond his tactical skill, Patton's heroic style of leadership, placing great emphasis on personal courage, led to the perception of him as a great commander, one whom the Germans genuinely feared. While he served for 4 decades in the armed forces, his legacy was ultimately carved out through 3 campaigns. In North Africa, between November 1942 and May 1943, in Sicily, briefly in the summer of 1943, and then in France, the Low Countries and Germany between July 1944 and May 1945. In each of these spheres, he made his fellow Allied commanders look like subpar generals, winning striking victories and advancing at great speed against the Germans and Italians, where others crept slowly forward. Patton's character was deeply paradoxical and controversial. He was a highly religious man, but one who had a dubious personal life and who often behaved in a vulgar manner. His post-war correspondence while governing Bavaria also leaves little doubt that he was quite anti-Semitic. Nevertheless, his unique character and command style has ensured him an enduring place in American popular culture. The 1970 film Patton, about his life, starring George C. Scott as Oh Blood and Guts, won 7 Academy Awards and helped cement his reputation as one of the most influential and fascinating figures of the Second World War. What do you think of George S. Patton? Was he an unstable warmonger who would have continued the war by attacking the Soviet Union if he had his own way? Or was he a military genius who surpassed all of America's other generals, including MacArthur and Eisenhower? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.